Hi, everyone. My name is Shaunna Happel, and I'm the president of Spectrum Leadership Solutions. Thank you for joining us today, the fourth webinar and the first webinar of 2023. Thanks to you, leaders, coaches, consultants, HR practitioners, and the feedback that you're continually giving us, we are bringing you today's topic, diversity, equity, and inclusion, how enriching your culture boosts the bottom line. There are three main keys that we want to talk about today. First being understanding why diversity, equity, and inclusion are the key pillars in business success. Second, providing you and leaders everywhere some tips on how to initiate and/or maintain diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. And lastly, we want you to leave with some concrete do's and taboos when incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives into your organization. So Dr. Shaunna P and Tara Taylor, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to share and showcase their expertise as practitioners in this field over a couple of decades. So let me go ahead and introduce you to our panelists today. So first, Dr. Shaunna P of Gold Enterprises is an educator, ordained minister, and highly sought after consultant in the equity and inclusion marketplace. Dr. Gold previously served as the Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at Towson University outside of Baltimore, Maryland. As a first-generation college student, Dr. Gold has climbed the organizational chart, starting as a residence hall director. She was later the campus minister and director of several multicultural centers, director of DEI assessment, and later the Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. Dr. Gold is an award-winning administrator, entrepreneur, and facilitator. She has recent honors as a Baltimore Business Journal Leader in Diversity, a team lead for Towson University's Truth and Racial Healing Institute, as well as a team lead for Towson University as the recipients of the Insight into Diversity Higher Education Excellence in Diversity Award in 2020. Dr. Gold has an MBA, a Master of Divinity, and Doctor of Education. She is also an Ironman triathlete and a busy mom of 2 boys. Welcome, Shaunna.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you all here. It looks like we have a lot of people, so I'm looking forward to chatting it up today about these great topics. Good to see you.
Tara, on to your bio and credentials. Tara Taylor is the managing director of ADR Vantage, a woman-owned consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. that supports clients across the U.S. through conflict management, organizational effectiveness, leadership development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Tara conducts facilitated dialogue sessions, designs and conducts trainings, and works with leaders to develop a more holistic and strategic approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, so employees of all identities and backgrounds can reach their highest potential. Tara has a unique combination of experience that weaves together a background in government relations and collaborative problem solving. She has spent almost 20 years creating and directing programs for the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights in workplace conflict resolution, OD work, leadership development, as well as human rights and social justice issues. Tara was certified as a mediator by the Arizona Attorney General's Office, where she subsequently managed dispute resolution programs and later managed a similar program for the Maryland Attorney General. Tara is a recipient of the Maryland Governor's 21st Century Award for Maryland Women in Responsive Government. And in 2019, Tara was named top 10 speaker by the Society for Human Resources Management Annual International Conference. She lives in Maryland and is also a busy mom of 2. Welcome, Tara. Thanks for being with us here today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. And so glad to be with my friend and colleague, Dr. Gold. Good to see that so many folks are joining us.
Great. Let me set the stage here. We have the honor of working with ADR Vantage that Tara leads, and Dr. Shaunna P is oftentimes a practitioner in DE&I for, and we have been seeing some similar themes over the years in leadership development and DE&I practices, which is how we ended up working together. And what I wanted to share with you first as a platform to how we became really active and involved in this work and showcasing it in our leadership development programs, what we have found is that a lot of leaders overestimate their ability to engage with their workforce. So I want to share just a kind of a background on this. It comes from a book called The Mind of the Leader by Rasmus Hougaard and Jacqueline Carter. They are Dutch and Canadian. And in their research, what they found is that almost 80% of leaders rated themselves very high on engagement, saying, yes, we're very engaging. We do a terrific job at this. And then they interviewed, and these were companies, Fortune 500 companies, global companies from all over the world, thousands of leaders that they interviewed. Then they interviewed the workforce, the employees and the people who worked for these leaders. And they said, hey, here are your leaders giving themselves a pretty high mark on engagement. What do you think? And guess what they found? Almost 90% of the employees who worked for these leaders said, engagement isn't nearly where it needs to be. We don't feel connected. We don't feel seen. We don't feel heard in the same way that our leaders are saying, hey, this is a priority and we're knocking it out of the park. So we spend over $46 billion a year in leadership development. What is this saying? We're missing the mark here. And we are hearing, as leadership development professionals, facilitators, and leaders, we are hearing very similar themes in the DE&I realm. So our goal for today is to share where we're missing it, how we're missing it, and how we as leaders, coaches, consultants can help take DE&I conversations and practices to that next level. So we want to make sure that our ratings are high in engagement, on connectivity, and being seen, and really giving everybody a sense of belonging. So what I'd like to do is ask all of you to rate your DE&I initiatives right now. And I know you have very diverse backgrounds right now, but here's the question, and we're going to do this in a Mentimeter, and Katya, I'll have you ask people to maybe pull out their phones, but here's the question we're going to ask you. If you had to rate your current organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, what grade would you give them? So we're going to talk you through this through Mentimeter. If you don't have access to Mentimeter, no problem. You can participate by putting something in the chat. But we would like you to pick one organization, if you're somebody that's working with several, or if you're internal, how are you doing? How would you rate the grade in your organization right now around diversity, equity, inclusion? And Katya, tell them what they need to do with Mentimeter.
No problem. Welcome, everyone. You'll open up a browser window or grab your phone and go to menti.com, or you can scan the QR code on screen. And you'll answer the question on screen. If you had to rate your current organization's DEI efforts, what grade would you give it? And we will see everyone's responses on screen.
And you'll also notice
Sarah,
that there's an, oh, go ahead.
I was just noticing that it's already starting to move. So our Mentimeter is working. So people are already responding. I'm excited to see how people feel. But right now we're around about a C level.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if you don't know, you'll also notice there's an option to say, I don't know, and that's okay too. And go ahead. I love that Mentimeter is on track here. And if you don't have access to Mentimeter, go ahead and put it in the chat. But as the answers continue to come in here, I'd like both you, Tara, and Shaunna to be able to talk a little bit about results that you're seeing here. And Shaunna, let's start with you. What are we looking at, and what does this mean to you?
Yeah, this is interesting. We're going to let folks go ahead and continue to add their responses into the Mentimeter. Just go to menti.com. The code is at the bottom, or you can use your phone's camera function to scan the little QR code in the corner and continue to add your responses here. But at this point, it's interesting that I'm not seeing any A's, but I'm also not seeing any F's here. So no one's getting great marks, but also no one's necessarily failing either. And so I think there's a lot of ambiguity here that we have. We're flirting with B's and C's right now, Tara. So I think that's interesting as well. What I'm always concerned with, though, is if we end up having folks that don't know, thank you for your honesty. And that helps us to really think about communication structures in the organization. There may not be much going on in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and or there may be some issues with communication of whatever is going on within the organization. So those are just a few things to think about as we continue to get results. But we don't have the bookends here, Tara, but we are hanging out in the middle. And so I think C is average. I'm not going to say how displeased I would be if my sons came home with a C. Tara, I don't know about your kids, but I'm going to be concerned if my kids come home with a C, right? What do you think?
Yeah, such a great point. I was sitting here going, what really makes an A versus a C, right? Some of you may be thinking, we have a lot of great ideas. We have a lot of celebratory, it's today's the day of, today's the month of, right? But it may not really be moving the needle in the ways that are most meaningful. And so I think it'll be interesting as we discuss, how do we define are great? How do we know when we're really doing well versus when we may be kind of at a mediocre level? And I think a lot of organizations are struggling with that right now. What they did in the past to get by on DEI is not enough now.
Absolutely.
And if you've never used Mentimeter before, what a great way to get engaged, right? So check out menti.com if you haven't had a chance to put your vote in there.
Love menti.com, and it's a great way to be inclusive. Speaking of inclusivity, right? Everybody has a chance to share what they're thinking in the moment. So thanks everybody for participating. I want to show you a few stats. Katya, I'm not sure if we have a chance to show them some stats on DE&I and company culture. We're giving you a few stats here, and I want to in particular stress the ones in the middle here. Companies that have diverse and inclusive workforces are 35% more likely to outperform their competitors, right? So back to the bottom line here, right? It's a thing, and businesses for no other reason should be paying attention to it for the bottom line, right? And of course, that is a very small reason compared to it's just the right thing to do. But I think it's interesting to match it to the business case as well. More than 3 in 4 employees and job seekers, that's 76%, report diverse workforce is an important factor when evaluating companies and job offers. How important is that right now for companies to retain talent? Really important. And diverse leadership teams deliver almost 20% higher revenue, right? So not only is it more welcoming to go work there, and that's what we're looking for, we also make more money when we have diversity in our organization. And more than 62% of workers say that they consider DE&I to be an important factor in their company's ability to drive success. So there's a business case for DE&I as well. And that's something that we've heard from our clients over the years. And I'd be curious to hear from you, both Tara and Shaunna, on what do you think that makes diversity, equity, and inclusion such key pillars in business success? Would love to hear from both of you. And Tara, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to note that if you've got thoughts or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Shaunna and I and Sarah really want to hear from you as well. But to the question of what makes DEI such a key pillar in business success, I think 2 things come to mind immediately for me. And Shaunna, I'll love to hear from you too. I'm going to go back to my point of it's where we are right now today, post George Floyd's murder, post Breonna Taylor's murder, post, a rise in Asian hate and anti-Semitism. And after all we've been through in a global pandemic, companies can't afford to not pay attention, right? If a key pillar of any business's success is to be aware of their surroundings, what's going on in the world that can either put them at an advantage or a disadvantage, then you want to be in the know. You want to be aware how to utilize and leverage your diverse workforce and how they work together best in order to make your best products, to thrive as an organization. The other thing I want to say is that customers are expecting more, employees are expecting more. We are at a day and age where people want to work for organizations that get it, that care, that are showing empathy and connection within the organization and care about them. Otherwise, they're out the door. They're looking for a better and different place to find meaning. Customers, same thing. They got their dollars to spend and they are going to choose to spend it with organizations that they feel they can get behind and support. And so I think in those two ways, that's really driving it. And then lastly, let me just add on, Sarah, you mentioned it, right? The bottom dollar does really reflect when there is more diversity, when there is more inclusion and belonging for employees, when customers feel like you're committed to the well-being of them and the employees, then people stay longer. There's greater retention. You have less turnover, more innovation happens. And really, what does that equal? More efficiency and better productivity. So that's how it's going to lead to success. Shaunna, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you put it beautifully. I would add that, yes, all of what happened in 2020, including a pandemic, and based on what our scholarship tells us about our experiences coming to, through, and beyond a pandemic, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a drum that's been beaten by many of us as DEI practitioners literally for decades. But what our scholarship tells us in 2020, the entire world had an opportunity to sit still and provide their undivided attention to what was going on in the world. And so if you go to websites like Say Their Names, where you see the laundry list of people who've lost their lives in many different ways that happen to look like me, when you see our Asian siblings being attacked, when you see anti-Semitism that's prevalent all the time, we're not saying that 2020, that anything new happened. The only thing that happened really new, based on the scholarship, is that our awareness shifted in such a way that we had to pay attention to what was going on. And so we did not have those distractions anymore. And so with that, that means that there's a number of things now that are rising to the surface. And what you'll find is, especially within your organizations, individuals who have been historically excluded from organizations, from industries entirely, from business, those folks are actually exhausted with work that other folks are just beginning when it comes to their journey. And that's okay that we're in different places, right? And so given that, I would suggest that some of the keys that we need to think of in regard to that business success is acknowledging that exhaustion from other people who both have had to live those excluded experiences and communicate them to people who may not understand them. That's one piece. And then the other piece too is remembering that now we're in a place where it's almost like a shift in understanding when it comes to the workplace. It used to feel as if the employer had a lot of power and got to dictate what mostly was going on in the workplace. Now we're seeing the shift to employees saying, no, I don't want to work in this type of environment. No, I'm not going to tolerate this type of treatment. Yes, I do want a sense of belonging, but you're going to have to work a little bit harder than just posting a diversity statement and putting together a ERG to make me feel good, right? There's going to be much more structure to it. And so in those ways, I think one of the things that we really focus on, and Tara and I do this a lot when we're talking to leaders, and especially when we're talking to organizations about retention, think about how expensive it is to lose folks and then go back out and find them again. I worked in higher education for a very long time, and a lot of my work had to do with search committees that went out searching for people who were highly skilled. And it's very expensive to pay very highly paid folks to look for other highly paid folks when you lose them every couple of years because we haven't put that infrastructure in place. So I would suggest that the retention piece is so expensive, we literally can't afford it. And so when people say, can't afford this DEI initiative, the converse of that for me is you can afford the DEI initiatives and programs much more comfortably than you can afford the turnover and the revolving door in your organization. And so those are a few things that I think about when it comes to being successful in business. You don't want that expense.
Well said, well put. And I loved your point around DE&I has been around for decades. And the two of you have been in DE&I long before DE&I was cool, right? Not that it wasn't ever cool, but it is interesting to see in society how the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, all these things are pushing society to pay attention in a way that they didn't before. And like you said, we can't afford not to listen and not to be inclusive. We're seeing some pretty exciting trends with our clients. For example, just a personal trend that I'm seeing is way more DE&I practitioners that are now coming into the C-suite. So you have, a CHO or CRO or COO, and now we have chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officers that have resources and have a team of people and have the platform to speak. So that's something that I think is really exciting, and also is seeing the bottom line increasing as well with that retaining talent and such. So I'd like to ask the two of you specifically, how have you seen DE&I boost the bottom line with some of your clients and organizations? Might you be able to share a couple of examples? And Shaunna, let's start with you first on this one.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I think what's really interesting is that Tara and I have had the opportunity to work with so many different industries. I used to jokingly say that I'd work with everyone but rocket scientists, but literally we now have worked with rocket scientists. We've worked with NASA. We've worked with other folks, folks that are in those STEM fields. And I would suggest what's really boosting the bottom line is definitely what you mentioned before around professionalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Previously, it was a really nice thing to do. Let's get a group of volunteers that have passion around the topic, create a DEI committee that doesn't have much mission, vision, direction, and that is now our performance of diversity. We're not doing that anymore. Yes, we do want those committees and we want that work in place, but we need someone that's a strategist. And when I think about that strategy, yes, we want those celebratory months and events and so forth. That I've done that work for many years, and that's crucial to heightening folks' awareness and their education about this work. But then you also need what I call the orchestra conductor. You need that chief diversity officer that's helping to weave DEI through around the organization in such a way that it really is baked into the organization. So then that directly affects a few things. Retention that we've already talked about when it comes to some of those internal pieces. Also, when it comes to expanding your market, right? So if you're in a business where you solely focus on one slice of a very large pie, you're missing out on a lot of money. So where is that market that you have not addressed? Tara and I, we've used this example before. That we have sons. She has one son, I have two. And what I think is so cool is that all three of them love Black Panther, right? We love the Marvel comics. And one of the things that's really cool about what Disney and Marvel did with that is, yes, we've had superheroes for decades, right? But once they started the Black Panther franchise, it wasn't just about certainly showing us visuals of Black people, Africans, African Americans, smart, brilliant in business. But they also opened up an entire market of individuals who never cared about superheroes, never cared about Marvel, to say, I'm showing up to the movie theater 2, 3, 4 times over to see myself. And so they opened up this entire market. And so that's when you see not just Marvel or superheroes profiting, but you see an entire market that's added that might not have ever entertained giving their money to someone to see a superhero on a screen. We can do that every single day with business. How are we opening up markets intentionally that we did not think of in the past because we did not have the infrastructure in place to lean towards those markets? So do you have structure in your organization that feeds into a number of different identity groups? We usually think about race, gender, sometimes sexual orientation, but there's 50 plus different identities that we all can think about that could widen our market. And so I think that's one way to boost the bottom line, in addition to that retention piece internally. There's tons that we can do externally. And Tara, we'll be at the next Black Panther movie together, right, Tara? But I think it's something, important to think about when we expand our market. But what do you think, Tara?
Yeah, I love that piece of, right, expanding the pie and attracting newer and wider audiences, creating, products and services that better meet an audience that perhaps you've never reached before. I can see that some of the clients we've worked with have been very narrow in the way that they have attracted their consumer base. Making certain assumptions about them because they live in a certain region, or because they're a certain age group, or because they have or don't have a certain identity. And when you start to judge your consumers by those identities, you really cut out the opportunity for everybody to have access to your service. And so I think that's, for me, the number one bottom line impact is don't cut yourself short. Don't remove an entire segment of your consumer base before you even know what's out there, an opportunity. And so the more diverse your ideas are, your workforce is, the more likely you are to connect to those consumers, to understand what they need best. Jocelyn, I see your comment, but I'm not going to read it in 1 second. I will. I'm going to finish this thought and then grab that. The other thing I want to mention here too is we can think about the bottom line in what it brings in, but also what do you stop yourself from losing? So let me just give you a couple of little factoids that always play in my mind. For hourly wage workers, folks who are working at local fast food restaurants or serving tables or in your, Wawa, bringing you out for your coffee, it takes an average of $49,000 to replace an hourly wage worker, right? So that person leaves because they don't feel connected. That person leaves because they hear a biased comment or a racial insult or a homophobic slur. Almost $50,000. Now, can you imagine how much it costs to replace somebody who is a salaried employee, right? It's at least double that. And these numbers I don't think are perfect, but according to SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, on average, it costs $160,000 to defend a discrimination allegation, right? And when we're talking about what happens in the workplace, there are lots of subtle behaviors that are non-inclusive, non-diverse, right? Whatever you want to call it, the slurs, the comments. But then there's also the illegal discrimination that happens by judging those individuals, making decisions about their salaries and whether they get assigned to certain jobs or whether they get promoted. $160,000 is the average to defend a discrimination lawsuit. So if you can imagine, that money is right out the door for organizations who aren't paying attention to this, right? Nobody has that money sitting around to be able to defend those lawsuits, to fill positions with high turnover rates. And so I'm always thinking, how much can I save by doing this work better, by paying attention to what my workforce needs in order for everyone to feel included, feel like they have a voice, feel like they want to contribute to the success of the organization. So, Sarah, I'm going to stop there because we might have a comment, but I think there's two ways to look at it, right? What can you bring in and what do you stop yourself from losing as an organization?
Yeah, and the comment in the chat is, while DE&I has been around since the 60s, the extraordinary political platform since 2015-16 seem to unleash or normalize overt prejudices. So DE&I consciousness is a required response. Like we need to know better.
Absolutely. If we look back, it's a great point, Jocelyn. If we look back, DEI was all compliance based, right? I come from a very long career in equal opportunity, EEO, right? Folks who were filing workplace discrimination complaints, and it was all compliance based. Does this fit the definition of harassment? Are our, managers following this? Now we're moving out of the compliance phase into the proactive inclusion phase. What are we doing so that we're not getting in trouble? So we're not defending ourselves in lawsuits. So people aren't leaving because of this, right? Or we're not opening ourselves up and exposing ourselves to much larger lawsuits, right? Now organizations have really learned compliance can't be the only way you look at this. You've got to be on the front end thinking about, how am I going to build an organization that not only thrives, but can weather the storm when bad things start to happen? And I'll tell you, the easiest thing employees will do is throw that organization under the bus if they don't feel like they're working for people who care about them, for organizations that care.
Yeah, that's so true. And Tara, I just wanted to add too, because you and I have worked so long and so hard with human resource practitioners and experts in this area. And because of that history of compliance that Tara is bringing up, that's the reason why oftentimes DEI is kind of squirrely as far as where do we put it in an organization. Sometimes we're trying to figure out, should we put it under the HR umbrella? Should we connect it directly to the CEO or to the C-suite and create that C-suite position? And what we're finding, simply based on the history, is that oftentimes human resource approaches to DEI are the floor, whereas DEI practitioners are looking at a higher ceiling to the work. That doesn't mean that it can't be compatible, but what I am saying is that oftentimes even the highest levels of human resource training and certification does look at that compliance lens, which is important. However, how can we go above and beyond the compliance? So when we're collecting data about our employees and those that we serve, are we collecting data that's required compliance, and or are we collecting what's above and beyond that, so that we continue to serve more and more markets at the very same time? And so sometimes, Tara, I feel like we're breaking up fights between HR and DEI because we want to play nicely in the sandbox, because we do need each other, but we're coming from different histories. And so how do we bring that together in order to continue to boost that bottom line that we're talking about here? I think that's a really important conversation that you're bringing up about the compliance issue.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing, Sarah, if you'll let me. And Shaunna, you tell me if you disagree with this, but I'm of the mindset that, quite frankly, DEI positions and efforts should not come out of the HR office. We see them as partners, and I think it's so important to have them. But from an employee perspective, HR is always going to be seen as the agent of the organization. And many organizations, the vast majority, do not, from an employee perspective, have 100% trust that HR is going to do well by them, right? There's been a long history of HR defending an organization rather than defending the employee. And so we have to be careful that from the get-go, we don't set people up to distrust the efforts. And one way that happens is by housing it in HR and seeing it as a compliance function. And all the employees go, yeah, see, they want to make sure they're not screwing up, so it comes out of HR. So I think that's like sort of a mistake you can make right out of the gate that you have to then work backwards to undo and build trust with the employees. So just something to think about as an organization. And if you're a leader, how to have that conversation with your executive team of where do we really want to house these efforts.
I 100% agree, and will not add any more to that. 100% agree. Absolutely.
It's such an interesting point too, because we're seeing some trends with our clients that they're actually renaming human resources. Now there are people and culture, for example, and there is a very distinguished line between DE&I efforts and human resources. And a lot of our HR VPs and heart-centered HR professionals are saying, hey, this is totally outdated, the way that we're running human resources. We have to be human-centered, and how does DEI play a part there? So it's coming, it's happening. We have clients that have already thought about even the language that matters in renaming and how we reorganize and restructure. And that brings me to my next question, which is, none of this is really possible without people speaking up and speaking into their concerns, right? So there's a big piece of psychological safety here that is floating around the whole DE&I effort and these pillars. So Shaunna, this question goes to you. How can leaders initiate diversity, equity, inclusion conversations with their employees and or colleagues or people around them while promoting psychological safety?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I've spent the majority of my career in this work facilitating difficult dialogues, and I kind of become very compatible with Tara's skill sets and certifications in conflict mediation. My goal is to have those difficult conversations before it needs to go to conflict mediation, but of course that's a necessary tool. And so given that, one of the things that I think is really key to difficult dialogues and having that psychological safety is for leaders, specifically leaders, mid-level managers, supervisors, anyone that has folks reporting to you. Remember the purposes of the communication. There's dialogue, which is its own language, if you will. There's dialogue, there's discussion, there's debate. All of those have different purposes. Usually as a supervisor, and I've been a supervisor since I started working at 16, 17 years old, supervising people, qualified or not. And as a supervisor, 99% of the time, we are looked at to fix things. fix it. We need you, Tara, you're the boss and you need to come up with a solution for XYZ challenge or problem. And so usually what ends up happening is that leaders, supervisors, so forth, they take in what's being heard and their immediate response is, here's my fix it. Here's my solution. Here's my response. When in fact, the conversation was not for you to necessarily create a solution. It was, number one, to be heard. And then secondly, to partner with that individual so that they know that they have been heard and also that their experiences are taken seriously. Right. And so given that, that's where we have to start to develop empathy when it comes to this work. So I would challenge anyone under the sound of my voice right now that's in this call, I would challenge you with a few empathy exercises when it comes to this work. Challenge yourself in your next meeting to, number one, ask your employee, your direct report, whomever, are they here to be heard or do they need a solution from you? Be very clear and ask that question, number one. And then secondly, if they don't need a solution from you, spend that time almost like an investigator, listening to every point that you can hear and the minute details of everything that they brought up to you, right? Because oftentimes we hear, but deep listening is a different matter altogether. And then as your decision making unfolds, you will remember those conversations. As other things pop up, you can connect dots and say, hey, 3 conversations ago, Tara, I remember you mentioning this. How does this connect with what's going on right now? And in that way, people do feel heard. But I think the challenge is we almost have to fight the inner monster within that's always trying to fix things, because that's been the role of US supervisors often, is that we're seen as the fix-it people. And so instead of that, knowing and being really wise as to when it's time to fix things, when it's time for your employees to be heard, and how to connect that to other decision makers and information that may be needed to support that individual. Because there's been too many times that my direct reports have come to me and said, no, I don't need you to fix anything. I just wanted you to hear what was going on and believe what you're hearing from me. And so I think those are a few things to foster psychological safety. And Tara and I have done a lot of training in this particular area in regards to everything else connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion being built upon this foundation of trust within your organization. And so there are organizations that need to either build trust because they don't have it, or how do you heal trust when it may have been broken because it's so easy to break? So those are just a few things to think about as well. But Tara, fill me in. Other things I haven't thought about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. And I'm reminded too that I don't know our audience very well. So when we say psychological safety, in its simplest form, I think, Shaunna, you can certainly add, but when we speak about it, we often are thinking creating an environment where people can participate, they can say what they want to say, they can be acknowledged and feel like they're heard, and they can even say what they want to say when they know it's going to go up against what others might think or do. And it's safe enough to do that, meaning there will not be repercussions. There will not be negative consequences simply because they speak up and may have a different opinion, right? And so that's pretty nuanced. That doesn't happen by, one swipe of the hand or one thing, right? It's built over time, as Shaunna was saying, trust and rebuilding trust. So I would say a couple of just things that come to mind for me is when leaders want to initiate difficult conversations, or oftentimes people interchange DEI and difficult. So one thing I want to say is it doesn't always have to be difficult, and don't wait till it gets difficult, right? So as leaders, it is on us to create spaces for people to have conversations when they need to in the workplace. If a product's not working, if a process isn't working, if you need to get different feedback, right? How can you as a leader create the space, the container, in order for people to feel like they can be included and participate in those conversations? And so don't wait till it gets so sticky. Don't, run down the hallway when people are talking about what's on the news, right? So don't wait. Believe people. I think, Shaunna, you ended on that, and I'm going to pick it up. It's one of our biggest tips to leaders. Believe people when they tell you what's happening to them. So I can't tell you how many leaders we have worked with, how many employees we have worked with. When someone says, I'm experiencing this in the workplace, or I overheard this comment, or I'm feeling left out and excluded, treated differently, the first response will be, are you sure? Well, maybe you didn't really hear it the right way. Or maybe, you're not giving somebody enough credit, or that's just how they are. We got to let it roll off the backs, right? We immediately put up a barrier that tells somebody your experiences are not accurate, not true. It invalidates. And as soon as that happens, it really shuts down the whole effort, the whole conversation, because somebody feels like I'm being told I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, what I'm experiencing isn't true. So don't wait to have the conversations. Believe them when they tell you. And the first thing you ought to be doing in those conversations, here's my conflict resolution hat coming out in my communicator hat, is acknowledge what they've said to you. I don't care if it's as simple as, oh my gosh, thanks for telling me. Or that sounds like it was a really difficult experience. Tell me more, right? You can follow with a question, but start with the acknowledgement, right? Because I think we forget that when people reveal something that makes them feel excluded or less than, it's a vulnerability. And by sharing it with you, they've put themselves in a vulnerable position. And so what we can do for them, the biggest gift, is acknowledge that in the moment. Just be right where they are in the moment. Then you can ask the questions that you want to go to, right? And that human connection is where I think employees thrive. I think it's where organizations thrive. Those are the most successful companies that I know of and that I've worked with, is because the caring, the heart piece you referred to, Sarah, is what's number one. Thanks for letting me go off on that a little bit.
That's perfect. And I was going to ask you, what are some things that we could all start or stop doing? And so you just answered that beautifully. Do this, don't do that. And, we hear this with our coaching hats as executive coaches too. I have clients that give me a call from 10 years ago, and they'll say, I'm in the neurodiversity community. I want to tell HR, for example, I'd like to have some support, but I'm the only person who looks like me, sounds like me, who has this. I don't want to draw attention, and I'm not sure if they would listen. Right. So they call me from 10 years. I'm trained to listen. Right. So acknowledging is so important. Or I've observed situations before where somebody steps into a lived experience that's very difficult for them. And the reaction is, well, who said that? Well, tell me when that happened. So, and it's strictly business, missing the person, missing that experience. So I love that your top tool for building trust that you both said was really acknowledge, listen, and be there to feel that person's pain or concern. And the other distinction too is it doesn't always have to be a difficult conversation, right? We like to call these things missing conversations. It's simply a conversation we haven't had yet. That's all. But a missing conversation could be one about gratitude or kudos or, hey, you're doing this really well. So if we can kind of reframe it's just a conversation, and that's our tool of choice to expand this, possibilities open up versus who wants to jump into and have this crucial or difficult or raging whatever conversation. So beware of the mindset that you're putting around this. It's such a great tip as well. Last question, and then I want to open it up because I'm seeing some wonderful things in the chat here. Also, make sure we're not thinking about this as a checklist and checking it off the box, and then we actually end up hurting the people that we want to help. So leaning into that, listening to that. Last question, and then I'll open it up to anybody else that wants to step into the expertise here that we have with the two of you. What is the secret to weaving DEI, regularly weaving DE&I conversations or initiatives or mission into company or corporate culture or any kind of culture that we have? What are some of those key distinctions? And would love to hear from both of you. And Tara, let's start with you first on this final question.
Yeah, I wish I had the secret, right, Shaunna? I wish I had the one secret. As you were saying that, Sarah, even though I knew you were going to ask me, I thought, gosh, I wish I knew the secret.
No pressure.
No. I think I'll give you two ingredients in the secret sauce. Let's say it that way. So two things really pop up for me. And I've spent this whole chunk of my career, right, in helping people sort of hear each other in a different way and communicate in a different way. So my tip would be meet people where they are. Many of us and all of you on this call obviously showed up because you're passionate about DEI work, right? We know we're doing it, why we're doing it. It's important to us. We know all the stats. You know, you probably can spout it out better than Shaunna and I. But we often want to drag people over to where we are rather than meeting them where they are. So when I think about coming to a leader or an organization that's really trying maybe to figure out what do they want to do, or does this even matter? Should they even care this much about it? Is to talk to them about what they care about, right? Do they care about a greater market share? Do they care about expanding their consumer base? Do they care about better talent? Getting more people in the door? Do they care about retention? Figuring out what they care about and then tailoring how you think diversity, equity, and inclusion weaves into that is really, really important. I think that there are so many leaders who feel like they're getting smacked on the knuckles or the wrist or whatever right now and getting in trouble for it. And many white male leaders or white leaders in general who feel like I don't have a space, or I'm going to say the wrong thing, or, I'm not really the person to have this conversation. And so what they wind up doing is not having the conversation at all. And so my other tip is start small, but just start, right? You don't have to have the massive DEI flow chart. You don't have to have, this 90-page, thesis on how to change, right? You can do one thing today, right? You can start acknowledging someone when they talk to you in any conversation before you ask a question. Thanks for telling me. Gosh, that sounds like a lot. That must be heavy for you this week, right? Those are acknowledgments. Start small. Think about asking somebody else in your organization, what should we be doing around diversity, and finding out what they say, right? Google diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace and see what's out there. Small steps add up to big changes. And I think we forget that and get overwhelmed and then just tap out, right? So meet people where they are, what's important to them, and start small. What's one thing you can do differently after today's webinar? I think that's where the momentum comes from. Shaunna, how about you?
Yeah, no, I love what you mentioned there. And I know that we usually try to start at like step one. I want to go back and start at step 0 of saying that when it comes to our businesses, our companies, our organizations, I want to start from the assumption that there is nothing about this company, organization, business that does not include DEI concepts. Not one thing. Everything touches DEI in some way. I was joking around with the CEO of an organization who happened to identify as a white male. And he said, well, what do you mean? If I'm the executive assistant, how does this pin connect with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, actually it does, because you said that you wanted to make sure that underrepresented vendors were part of your procurement process. So have you looked to see if you could find some underrepresented manufacturers of pins and then determine where you're going to purchase them from? And he thought I was joking, but then he went and did a quick Google search, and lo and behold, he's found a bunch of vendors that he could have been accessing, right? And so given that, again, my first assumption is there is nothing about your organization that does not have DEI all over it. So that's my first thing. The second thing that I would say is always know that in this work, tagging on to what Tara mentioned about starting small, in this work, as you start small, become very comfortable with failing forward, getting up and doing it again, right? I didn't teach my boys how to ride their bike by saying, you're never going to fall off and you're going to be in the Tour de France next summer. What we knew was mommy's going to get the peroxide and the Band-Aids, and I'm going to be right here as you learn how to do it, right? And so given that, knowing that even as Tara and I have decades of experience in this area, we make mistakes daily. And the issue is not to wallow in the mistake, but to use that mistake to fail forward, because it's a learning experience. So then you can say, thank you so much for correcting me on that. I am so sorry, and I hope I did not create more harm. I will do better next time based on what you taught me, and move forward from there. And so tagging on to that, I think it's really important to make the blanket assumption that it's everywhere. It's not an addendum to a big strategic plan. It's everywhere. and then learning how to use your daily experiences in order to learn and grow on your individual journey when it comes to DEI work. So those are my two things I'd suggest.
Wonderful. Great tips, great tools. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And I want to open up for the last, 6-7 minutes or so that we have left to our very patient participants, listeners. If you want to add a question or a comment in the chat, I see that there are already many coming through. Thank you for that. You can come off camera if you'd like and get your voice in the room and share something. What else would you like to know from our experienced panelists here? Something that you'd like to share, any questions that you might have for them while you have them at your fingertips. I just want to hold some space for any questions, comments, or thoughts that you all might have in our last few minutes. Go ahead, Juliet.
I know you're shocked, Sarah, that I would raise my hand. One of the things that I wanted to say earlier in the conversation, you mentioned innovation, the impact of DEI on innovation. And this is something that matters a whole lot to me as a human-centered design practitioner. And goes back to the point that I was making earlier, DEI is a strategic function, should be a strategic function. I remember when was it, 5-10 years ago, all of a sudden HR, which was a support function, an operational function, everybody started saying, well, HR is now a strategic function, workforce of the future, workforce of this, workforce of that. The same thing needs to happen with DEI to me, and I'd love to hear more about your experience about how that is currently happening. DEI being seen as a strategic function because, as you said, it touches absolutely everything, but also it touches everybody. If we look at DEI, and as you can hear from the accent, I'm a freaking mini United Nations model just by myself. So DEI matters a lot to me as the core definition of DEI as we understand it. I'm a female. I come from multiple cultures. I am not quite blonde and white. And yeah, I mean, I'm straight, but that's besides the point. But beyond that is everything else that DEI is. Everybody has an aspect that relates to DEI, whether it's neurodiversity, as Sarah was saying. That's really something I'm also very interested in as as part of human-centered design. I always try to invite to my workshops people who think a little bit differently, or even communicate differently because they come from a different culture where bluntness is values versus American soft speaking and so on. And I'd love to see, and I'm sorry, I'm not making sense. I'm bringing everything in together, but that's my point, is that DEI touches everything. It touches innovation, it's a strategic function, and it touches everybody. And I'd love to see how expanding this conversation, making it strategic, making it a non-negotiable, not just because you want to access a bigger piece of the market, but because it's what the future is like. So I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I just wanted to see how this very messy comment landed on you.
Well, I will say that one thing that I'll just suggest, Lily Zhang has a great book right now called DEI Deconstructed. And it really speaks to your point around, and this has been a frustration of mine for many years until Lily launched their book. But the frustration has been around, again, going back to what I mentioned before, of DEI being a good thing to do and the right thing to do, in comparison to DEI being a profession. It is a skill set. It's just like a surgeon. And so given that, what does it mean to now professionalize DEI in such a way that you have people that come in with very specific skill sets in order to do that work? And so I would suggest that because it's now becoming such a structural part of business, organizations, companies, and so forth, now the emphasis on how it is a profession is a big deal now. And I think that's something that we really need to think about as far as what skill sets are we bringing in that lend themselves towards that functional and structural work that's a requirement of the organization. Yeah.
Yeah, Jocelyn, I see your hand and I want to give just a quick 30-second and come to you. So one thing that I've started to recommend, and I think this works really well for a lot of our clients, is to identify somebody on the management team, wherever they are in the structure, who I don't want to say they play devil's advocate, but they play the role of how is this going to land on our employees, our customers, our vendors, right? Their job in strategic sessions, in strategic planning, in any kind of management meeting is to go, wait a minute, is this going to perhaps have an impact that we don't intend? Is this going to exclude? Is this going to, land in a certain way that we haven't anticipated? Just simply building in that person's role to do that has been really effective. I've seen them avoid big missteps. I've seen them think about who aren't we thinking about, who's not in the room. But you've got to identify and kind of give permission for somebody to be that role. So that might be one example of something that could be an easy, you don't have to pay a salary, but you can identify that person and maybe rotate it once a month. That's that person's role, to really step outside and be like, what aren't we thinking about? Jocelyn, sorry.
Yes. Final comment. Thanks,
right.
Jocelyn.
And I've been listening and haven't formulated exactly how I want to say this, but as a mediator on various panels, EEOC, Postal Service, and so forth, I am struck by the reality that besides the educational system, and I'm from the Deep South, so we all know that wasn't always equal. It used to be very equal back in the old days, but became less so from the 50s forward. There is so much learning that occurs at the knee of your mother and father growing up in interpersonal relationships. And I am struck by the fact that when I am hearing, especially maybe an aggrieved charging party, not able to articulate the complaint and even the suggestion of a remedy in the kinds of manner and terms that are going to be heard by someone who's grown up with a whole different life experience. And it's almost like I wish they had a coach before they got to the session. And maybe that ought to be a business for somebody somewhere, And it's so hurtful. And of course, when I get to reframe as the mediator, I can maybe be helpful with that. But when you say go in the office, and I love the idea, you want to be heard or you're looking for a solution. That's so cool. If they want to be heard, I'm just so hoping and wishing that it gets said in such a way it can be receptive. And how can that happen when we grow up with such different life experiences? That's all.
Thanks, Jocelyn.
Articulated that well, but
just a few. That's a huge whole conversation in and of itself. And I know we're at time, but I want to give Shaunna and Tara just a final few 30-second response to that. Let's start with you, Shaunna.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I live here in the Maryland area, what we call the DMV area at the moment, but I'm originally born and raised in Southern Virginia, which has not been kind to African Americans and other people that are non-white. And so I do understand what you're mentioning here. I think you're right that unfortunately we have many folks have been born and raised in such an experience that they've never been challenged to communicate themselves in such a way that they should expect a different point of view. It's really actually very shallow communication with people that you're going to relate with and are going to understand you, because you never have to more deeply explain your experience and your understandings. And so given that, I think you're right, that might be someone else's business to help people to develop that skill set, because that's a skill set that people show up not having because they've never been challenged to do so. So I think you're right on target with that. And so therefore, if you're never challenged to articulate your point of view and what your point of restitution will be, it's very hard to come to terms because it's like several people speaking different languages that are having a really hard time to communicate with one another. Yeah, but I'm not the certified mediator like Tara, so I'll pass it over to you, but that's my perspective on that. There's a pre-conversation before we come to the table for some resolution.
Yeah. So Jocelyn, I invite you to reach out to me and we can have this conversation. And Shaunna's been with me for a long time in this journey. As a mediator, you know, you've got a certain role to play that you don't want to necessarily be perceived as partial. However, in any kind of conflict resolution situation and in any kind of communication, I think one of the things that I've really stepped into as a practitioner is calling out what I'm seeing, right? And by that, I mean, so I'm hearing you say this message and I'm not sure it's landing in the way that you had intended. I wonder if I can ask a couple of questions to help flesh this out. Would that be okay with everyone, right? So I'm sort of signposting that I'm noticing there might be this disconnect and go from there. I'm not speaking for them. I'm not adding to it. So-and-so meant this by it, right? And I don't think we should ever be trying to sort of carry somebody's message for them, but to say, I'm noticing something's not landing well. There's tension in the room. Perhaps the way you're saying it isn't being heard, right? That kind of thing. And then offering a chance to ask questions. And that's when I get really into my open-ended questions. And I think I do that as a consultant as well, is to say, I can hear you wanting to do this. I'm wondering if it's going to have the impact that you told me you wanted to have. Can I ask you a few questions? Right. And I found that to be particularly helpful. So I know that oversimplifies it since we have so much more to talk about, but I want to offer that as one way to kind of get in there. Thanks, Sarah.
Beautiful. And I also want to applaud the efforts of, you know, what a wonderful example of, hey, I'm from the Deep South. I didn't even know this was a thing, right? So where can we start learning about other people who aren't like us? And guess what? When they're telling us it's a thing, we better listen up, right? So I think there's a beautiful invitation for everybody to learn about people who aren't like us in whatever identity that is, whatever community that is. And that's on us to continue the learning. So I want to thank you, Tara and Shaunna, for the wonderful thoughts, experience, and expertise that you brought to us. What wonderful tidbits you gave us. And Katie, I'll pass it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Shaunna. So we have some resources that Katya has shared in the chat here. And again, I will be sending a follow-up email to all of you with the recording and resources, as well as resources shared here. Thank you all so much for attending. And we would love to get your feedback. So Katya has shared a survey in the chat, and I will also follow up with that as well. We'd love to hear how this session was and what else you would like for us to present. So just wanted to thank everybody for this session. And like we said, we'll be doing our next webinar in the fall. And please reach out to any of us if you'd like to have any further discussions. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.